largely due to the perceived abuse of power perpetrated by the Federalist Party. Things like the Alien and Sedition Acts, this unpopular quasi war with France. You see the Federalist Party fall from grace, in the public side, that is. And therefore, the presidential election that took place in 1800, pretty much ensured Jefferson and his party, the Republican Party, to replace the Federalist Party. So John Adams only served one term, and Jefferson arrives in 1800 into the White House. Now, interestingly enough, Jefferson loudly proclaimed during his campaign that he was going to return the republic, especially its government, back to the quote spirit of the revolution, unquote. What does this mean? It means that from Jefferson's perspective, the Federalist Party, and this is again the first government that formed when the Constitution was just written and ratified, right? The Federalist Party that was elected into positions of power according to that design rendered within the Constitution, right? What they did is overstep their authority. And this was in many ways a betrayal of what the revolution was all about, according to Jefferson and like minded people like him. Uh, for example, let's recall that the whole controversy surrounding the Townsend duties, the Granville duties, the Stamp Act, the Tea Act was about this idea of a central government that is imposing tyrannical rule upon the people. So, this is how Jefferson promoted himself. And indeed, when he won, he, in a self referential way, designating himself, that is, said that his ascendancy to the executive position, presidency, constituted, quote, a revolution of 1800. Those are his own words, his term to describe his winning the election, okay? Quote, the revolution of 1800. So, what does this mean according to Jefferson? Well, this aligns with what I just explained a bit earlier, that Jefferson remarked that his victory is basically a mandate that the people agree with, right? In terms of restoring the government back to the way it should be. That is to say, small government, or to use our term, weak government, right? Even though the Constitution enlarged all the powers of Congress, as we know, not to mention, created the federal, the judicial branch and the executive branch. Jefferson was inspired in the beginning to shrink government back down to the way ideally it should be, minimal government, that is. He even demonstrated this in his own, inauguration. He refused to dress up. He wore a everyday coat. He didn't wear those fancy wigs that they did back then. He just put his hair in a little queue like he always did. He didn't want the, carriage, the horse and carriage, all the pomp and circumstance that surrounded the inauguration. He just walked, right? He took the oath of office and then just went home, probably read a book like he always did, right? And even when he entered office, he slashed the budget, right? The federal budget. He slashed the military budget, the Navy budget specifically. And let's remember that we just had a war in the high seas with France. So, he's getting away with that, or doing away with it, actually. He is slashing money put aside to create Washington, D.C. as this sort of capital in league with the French capital, right? Or the English capital. In other words, the large cities of Europe. So he says, we don't need that, right? Let's just slash this, slash that. Let's keep government minimal and small. Okay, so this exemplified and demonstrated that he's serious about this idea of revolution of 1800. That is to say, to keep the federal government small and to restore it back to the ideals that were formed during the American Revolution, from the Grenville duties and the Stamp Act onward until, of course, 1776. Now, one thing that is truly revolutionary about Jefferson's presidency, and this is not what he meant by it, this is kind of my own personal interpretation, but one thing we do recognize as, quote, revolutionary, once Jefferson succeeded Adams and indeed the Federalist Party itself, it's not exactly the return to the revolution and its ideals, like I said, because as I will discuss, Jefferson is going to stray from his early idealism and his early sort of idea of the revolution and applying that to his government and keeping it small. In other words, he's going to be, contradictory, and even you could say, he's going to betray his own principles as president that he originally had entering office. But going back to how you could see it revolutionary, one way to see this is a peaceful of transfer of power. Okay, a peaceful transfer of power. This is what was truly revolutionary about what happened in the election of 1800. Now, for time immemorial, certainly during the feudal era and even before that, right? Whenever you see a transfer of power, it's almost always accompanied by violence, war. Okay, because that's how power was understood. When one empire succeeds another or one emperor succeeds another, it's usually accompanied by a lot of violence. But here, and let's remember, it's a democracy, right? What's happening is this is the modern era, and again, the United States is the first modern republic. We are putting these principles into operation. Is it going to work? So what you have here is an example of it indeed working. You see a peaceful transfer of power from the Federalist Party, which has a set of agenda that's antithetical to Jefferson's party, which is the Republican Party again. So this peaceful transfer of power will demonstrate that this idea of democracy, Madisonian representative democracy, to be specific, has indeed worked, at least at this point. Okay. Now, talking about transfer of power, this obviously applies to 2020, the year of the presidential election, and it's mired in controversy again, right? Whether this is going to be a peaceful transfer of power, right? So that's one thing, again, that was truly revolutionary about Jefferson's rise to the presidency. Now, as I just mentioned, what's going to happen is Jefferson, once he takes a seat in this position of executive power, he's almost immediately going to recognize that he cannot maintain that principled stance that's based on strict constructionism. Hopefully, you recall what that is. Just to briefly recap, constructionism is basically interpreting the Constitution in a literal fashion. Now, what's an example of this? It's almost from the beginning. And let me go back a little bit and talk about Adams, the second president that Jefferson succeeds. Well, Adams, when he realizes he loses the election, right? And literally in the last day of his office as the president, he installs these various federal judges to key positions within the country, right? Federal judges. Now, one thing about federal judges, they're appointed for life. But Jefferson comes in, and by the way, why does Adams do this? He felt that this is a good way to form an obstacle, right? To prevent the Republican agenda from being realized. It will basically form this obstacle, right, to prevent Republican reforms by having Federalist judges there to block it. So it's a form of obstructionism. Okay, so Jefferson is recognized this, and by the way, the name for this was midnight judges. Why? Because they're appointed in the midnight hour of Adams's presidency. Now, again, Jefferson realizes this almost immediately upon entering office. He's infuriated and wants to do something. He starts removing judges. Can you do that? Can the executive remove judges appointed for life? That's an interesting question because, as I said, if you read the Constitution in a literal fashion, like Jefferson likes to do, you can't do that. But Jefferson is doing it right away. And what we see happening is some of these midnight judges actually suing the federal government, saying, "You can't remove me, I'm appointed for life," like the Constitution explicitly states. Now, this leads to a famous court case called Marbury versus Madison, and Marbury is one of those midnight judges. So Marbury again sues the government, saying that is that he can't be removed, and it basically leads to the Supreme Court favoring the federal government. But probably more important than the actual decision is the precedent that is established with the court case of Marbury, the midnight judge challenging his removal, right, versus Madison or the federal government. Okay. And it's the precedent of judicial review. Okay. So, what is judicial review? It basically gives the Supreme Court the authority or the power to determine the constitutionality of all laws in the country, regardless of it being a state law or a federal law. The Supreme Court has that power. It is now established as a precedent. And still today, should be obvious to you, right, that the Supreme Court still does this. This is, in fact, how people think of the Supreme Court as practicing what I just described, which we now know is judicial review. Now, that statement you see there on the slide is what's emblazoned in the walls there once you walk in to the building in Washington, D.C., where the Supreme Court is. It is emphatically the province and duty of the judicial department to say what the law is. So that's the precedent established in 1803. Well, let's return to Jefferson for a little bit because I did mention just earlier that Jefferson is going to realize very quickly, once he becomes president, that he can't really maintain that stance that's based on this principled viewpoint, right? Things like, constructionism, where you interpret the Constitution literally, which puts a check on, the federal government's power, right? Or, maintaining fidelity to the spirit of the revolution, so on and so forth. What's going to happen is he has this rude awakening, in a sense, where he realized he had to make decisions that departed from those principles. And he felt they had to be made, and they're justified. Why? Because it's for the good of the Republic. But doesn't this sound exactly like the Federalist, let alone someone like Grenville, when he's worried about the English empire's treasury depleted, right, due to the 7 Years' War? Or Townsend, the same thing, right? Let alone Parliament. They're trying to act from a pragmatic viewpoint in trying to rescue the empire, right, from crashing into the shoals of bankruptcy, right? Well, Jefferson realizes that he does have to think pragmatically. Okay, so by the end of his 2 terms, certainly by his second term, he is going to make decisions that aren't based, let's just say, on the strict constrictionism sort of lens, right, or interpretive framework. What's one example of this? Well, let me provide a well-known example, and that's the purchase of the Louisiana Territory. Now, this land to the west of the Republic, before it was purchased, all of a sudden became available to the United States for purchase. And indeed, Jefferson sent his diplomat over to France. France is the empire who had possession of this land at this time. He sent this guy Livingston over to negotiate with Bonaparte, who was the leader at the time, Napoleon. And Napoleon is too interested in his conquest of Europe. If you know anything about Napoleon back then, this is what he's trying to do. He's not concerned with the New World. So we even lowballed Napoleon, and he bit, right? We purchased 828,000 square miles of land for $15 million, which is a huge bargain. So this was done by Jefferson, but Jefferson knew beforehand that this power was not delegated to the federal government, to the executive position. So here he was stuck in a dilemma. It's a good thing for the Republic to get this land, yet, if I don't act fast, it's going to slip from our hands. So what do I do? Well, he realized he had to act. So this is an example of that pragmatic way of thinking about politics rather than that principled way. So again, Jefferson is showing here that that principled stance is not going to work in this republic, right? If you're in a position of the federal government, that is. Okay, so this is one example of how Jefferson strays from the quote spirit of the revolution. Now, what happens here is Jefferson serves 2 terms and he abides by the precedent established by Washington earlier to only run for 2 terms, right? And not to run for a 3rd term, even though you probably will win. Washington certainly should have or could have won if he ran for a 3rd term. Why didn't he do it? Because it would seem too close to that of a monarch who seems to rule for a lifetime. So he wanted to avoid that oppression. And so too does Jefferson abide by that informal precedent. By the way, today it's actually an amendment in our Constitution that presidents could only serve 2 terms. Because we had one example of a president who served for 4 terms, you might know this, and that was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was president for 4 terms during the Great Depression and World War II. In any case, you see the Republican Party still in charge here. Madison becomes the next president. And then by 1812, we see this war break out with England again, the War of 1812. Why does it break out? Quite complicated, but basically, English ships started harassing American ships and impressing soldiers, excuse me, not soldiers, American sailors. What does impressment mean again? It means that they're kidnapping these sailors and forcing them to work into that foreign army, right? Because being a sailor really sucked back then. Okay, so they're doing that, and the United States accused England of furnishing arms to some Indians that the United States was fighting right in the South. So basically, war broke out, and this war was really a stalemate. We didn't win, but the fact that we didn't lose actually was very important because, again, in principle, right, or let's just say on paper, so to say, we were supposed to lose this war because the English Empire is still the mightiest around. Okay, but historians have called this the Second War of Independence. Why? It's because you see increasing nationalism, for one. Okay, the fact that, again, we arrived at a stalemate where the mighty British Empire made us proud to be Americans. And again, I remind you that nationalism, right, takes a while to really seep into the American consciousness, right? Most people put their state first in terms of personal identity. Who do you identify with? Your state. I'm a Virginian first, an American second, or even third, right? So you see nationalism becoming stronger, in other words. And definitely this will be true by the Jacksonian era. All right, another reason why it's called the Second War of Independence is because after the war ended in 1816, 1815, 1816, we see the United States um, separating from England economically. What does this mean? Well, ever since Hamilton, right, we depended on England for our commercial development, right? Certainly with trade. Trade with England was very important. And after the War of 1812, however, the United States decided to focus less upon establishing trade relations with foreign countries, especially England, and to shift its focus towards economic self sufficiency. Okay, this is called economic nationalism. All right. So these two sets of nationalisms are a result of the War of 1812, one which is more in terms of identity, right, but also economic nationalism. And for that reason, we really cut the umbilical cord, if you will, with the mother country or the former mother country of England after the War of 1812. We're no longer going to be beholden to them, and especially economically, once we cut that relation. So that's why it's called the Second War of Independence. So this is the legacies that we associate with the War of 1812, and we already mentioned these, some of these: economic independence, rise of nationalism, the fall of the Federalist Party, because they're still around. But during the War of 1812, they basically collapsed. That party would disintegrate. All right. Now, when it came to the Republican Party, Jefferson's party, what we do see is interesting. We see a shift and a political realignment in what the Republican Party meant. Now, let's remember that with Jefferson, the Republican Party was all about, at least in the very beginning, keeping it small, government that is, and minimal, putting states before the federal government, and so on and so forth. Things like even constructionism, right? Now, what you see is, for starters, the rise of the so called war hawks here. And who were the war hawks? War hawks were young Republicans, okay, who were too young to experience the American Revolution. So, therefore, they have this different attitude and different idea in terms of this new republic. They're very nationalistic. And in fact, they want to use the federal government to promote this new republic to achieve not only economic independence, but even greatness. All right. So the Warhawks, again, are a young generation of leaders who are going to rise and basically take over that revolutionary generation. All right. So again, the Warhawks is a direct legacy of this period because we see the Warhawks affecting what's called a political realignment. And basically, political realignment, in this case, it has several meanings, but in this case, it means the shift, and it's a fundamental shift in the ideology and agenda of the party. Okay, so what's an example of this in more recent times? Let's say the party of Lincoln during the Civil War, right? It started as the party of anti slavery into the Western territories. You probably know this. But after the war and after Reconstruction, when our country underwent intensive industrial revolution, it shifted from, anti-slavery to big business And in many ways, still today, Republican Party is about big business. So it underwent, in other words, a political alignment. So here we have a political realignment as well, with the Warhawks changing the complexion of the Republican Party ideologically. It's no longer about, quote, the spirit of the revolution, let alone the revolution of 1800. It's more about nationalism and the attempt to make this republic great.